Welcome to Strato Trees. I hate negative rigging, but sometimes it's got to be done. If you have to negative rig something like I did recently on this big nasty pine job, just in the worst possible spot with no landing zone and all sorts of horrible hazards, and of course it was covered in sap to boot. There's a few things you can do to make the operation smoother, to create some redundancy, and to eliminate some of the tedious steps that you have to have in the process that where each one is kind of an opportunity for error. So I'll get into that a little bit deeper here. Thank you, Jobber, for sponsoring this video. Let's dive in. So the process of negative rigging has a lot of steps, and an error in any one of those steps can cause a catastrophic failure. So that's not the kind of workflow that I like to do anytime I can avoid it. For example, I've got a negative rigging setup going on here. I want to make sure that I've got my anchor is choked nice and tight to the tree. I'll generally actually want this to be nice and low. So you also need to make sure that you've got your lanyard on, not over the top of the rigging rope. That can cause problems. This was a deadeye sling that has my pulley on it. Usually I'll use an ultra sling. Either way, that's something I have to set every single time. I got to make sure it's set right, it's snug, the knot is good. Got to make sure my rope is running up and actually inside the pulley. Make sure the pulley is closed. I'm going to make sure that I've got my face cut in before I tie this on so I don't accidentally nick my rope. I'm going to make sure this is nice and secure. Nothing hung up, not, a little slack like that or anything. It's got to be good and tight. If I'm on a smooth bark tree or if I've got straight pieces with no nubs, usually I'll cut a little notch into here so that the rope will sit inside that notch, and that'll keep it from, assure more confidently that it's going to hold on. So I generally prefer negative rigging with a block instead of a ring, and I'll show you why. A ring, even multiple rings, although you have less of a problem with those, but especially a lone ring. If you have a significant load and certain types of leans, you can actually pinch the rope, the back side of the rope here against the tree trunk while this side is getting loaded really hard. And then that isolates the strand that's going to your piece, and that can cause this thing to snap. It can cause really high, sharp spikes in load to your rigging line. And I just don't like that. The risk of that is kind of gnarly. So generally, if I'm negative blocking, I want to use a pulley instead of a ring. Especially, I like these pulleys that have the nice tall cheek plates. Obviously, this could still pinch, but because the cheek plates are tall, it would have to really smash into the tree pretty hard before it's going to bite on the rope. And you've still got a bearing in there, so the rope will tend to want to run through, even if it is pinched a little bit. Much more so than if the same thing happens with a ring. And then, you go ahead and you make your cut. And even when you make your cut, you're still cutting close to your rigging and your climb line, your flip line, all this stuff. I just don't like running my saw so close to everything, but it kind of has to, because the longer this distance from the pulley to the cut, you get exponentially more forces, the bigger that gap is. And so I really want this to be short, as tight as possible. And that forces you to end up cutting close to your rigging. So you got to be super careful about that. And then normally we're doing this stuff kind of at the end of the day after we rig the rest of the tree out, and that's all a problem. So I like to use methods that are safe, repeatable, minimal steps, and where there's redundancy and some room for error. So let me show you some of the alternatives that I used on this last job to kind of make it a little bit safer. The first thing I try to do whenever possible is use a tip tie, if that means I got to go to a neighboring tree or if I got to use a spar from the same tree. And just like good rigging technique takes a lot of the guesswork, the uncertainty, and the loss potential out of the rigging, Jobber does the same for your admin. A lost bid is lost money. So being able to keep track of all of your estimates, all of your leads, keep track of your old client list, being able to quickly send out an email to your whole old client list, let them know, hey, it's fall, it's time to do some trimming. Things like that really allow you to make money a lot more efficiently, and more importantly, they keep you from losing money that results in those forgotten contacts, like forgetting to call someone back or forgetting to let them know about their trimming that's overdue. They also have other great features like route planning. If you've got a bunch of bids to do, it'll schedule your route so it's real efficient. You can make custom line items so that when you go to fill out a bid, it's much easier, much faster. I've been using them for years and they've saved me a lot of time and energy, and I expect you would like them too. So if you don't already have a CRM software, check out Jobber, and thanks again for sponsoring this video. back to the action. I really like to be able to have a tip tie, obviously, instead of negative blocking if it's at all possible. Even if I've got a weird angle and I got to pull it off to the side, a lot of times that's still safer and more secure. And if I have to butt tie and tip tie, I'll use my GRCS, I'll use some pre-tension to pull the top off, and then I'll let the butt drag either through a porta wrap or some other friction device to ease that piece off to the side. And that makes it so that we don't have the big weight dropping into the rig, and that's way better on the ropes. We get much lower forces, much lower peak forces. It's more secure all the way around because we're pre-tensioning this. If something's gonna slip, it slips ahead of time. That is the way to go if possible. Of course, it's not always possible. On this big pine, we weren't able to do that until we got quite a ways down on the trunk. And then we were able to pull it to this pine behind us that was fairly tall. Another thing I like to do is speed line. So instead of just straight negative rigging, catching every chunk, I can set up my normal negative rig, but I can also set up a speed line running away. This is the speed line. It's choked off there. It's gonna cause the piece to drift down and it'll get caught in the belly down there eventually. Now, the way tension lines work, you could pre-tension a line as tight as you can pull on it, basically. But if you then load it midline, especially dynamically, you can create really ridiculous spikes in forces at either end of that tension line. So you can blow out the knot on one side or the other pretty easily. And you can also create a huge amount of lateral force, that torque, at the tree where the rope is connected. So you can pull tops out of trees, you can pull a small weak tree over completely by loading that midline with tension, or that speed line with tension. So when you're speed lining, generally you want to operate with as much slack of the system as you can afford. And that's typically dictated by how much height you have to drop and how heavy the pieces are that you're dealing with. I'll put up this little picture here, this chart that shows how much extra tension you get on either side as a function of the percentage of the weight of the mass you're carrying in the middle. You do not want high masses in the middle of a highly tensioned line. You're creating leverage to just blow up your rope and cause big problems. But it shouldn't be sharing much load at all at first. At first, almost all the weight is going to be caught on this bigger, a little bit more dynamic 5/8 line through a block like you would normally expect. So it's going to drop. This yellow line will do most of the catching, but then this other line will start taking more and more load as it gets lower. The speed line will also absorb energy as the piece rides. And that lets me take fewer wraps on this. It lets the groundy have a little more wiggle room with how much he lets it run. And that speed line or that high line will absorb the energy in increasing amounts as it reaches the bottom. And so it's this really nice sort of smooth handoff of forces between the rigging, the primary rigging line and the speed line. So we're tied on twice. We got a little bit of redundancy. We're gonna get the piece to drift over there and we're not gonna hit any of the stuff underneath me. If either one of those were to fail, theoretically the other should be able to hold it. The other nice thing is when you're doing a speed line with a negative rig, say this is my ring, so I would tie this guy on, run my speed line through it. When I'm all done, I can just use the tail, have the guys tie the tail of my ring to my rigging line, and when I pull the whole thing back up, it all comes together. And it makes it easy to set up on the next one. I don't ever have to even take the ring off of the speed line. It can just live on there. Speed line itself, I used a choking snap, so I didn't have to tie and untie that knot over and over again. A few things I did to take variables out of the whole system is I bought a new rope, so I don't have to worry about something being stressed previously. I know what it's rated for and it's gonna be good. I started small to get a feel for the new rope on the friction devices because every rope interacts a little bit different. I created redundancy by combining the speed line system with the negative block and tackle. I also made it less likely for me to drop things by using that ring and keeping it on, and that was less knots to tie as well, which I like. I also use that choking carabiner for one of those terminations. Again, less knots to tie, easier to take apart, set up again, and less likely to pull through. And I used the block instead of the ring, and I made sure that the lowering devices themselves were not directly underneath the pieces I was rigging, so if something does fail, all goes to hell. My groundy's not sitting right in the crash zone. There's a lot of different things you can do to make your rigging a little bit safer. Then of course, at the end of it all, I switched to a positive rigging technique instead of negative. Again, because it's safer, it's more reliable, it's more consistent. And as soon as that was possible, we went ahead and did that. So made it for an awesome job. Everything went super smooth. I was really happy with it. But Those are all things to think about the next time you get asked to block down a big nasty tree. Thanks again, Jobber, and thank you guys for watching. Hope you found that really valuable. I've got lots more videos. Let me know in the comments what else you'd like to see me talk about, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.